In this section, we're going to explore functions in context. So we're going to build upon what we've already done with functions, but now essentially in word problems. So let's start with a warm-up here. I think it's a very valuable one for us to make sure that we've mastered. For problems 1 through 2, use the following scenario. A is a function of B. So I'm going to do my highlighting here. That of B, that would be our input, and then A would be our output. It says which variable represents the domain of the function. Domain, again, is our inputs, so that would be B. And range would be our outputs, so that would be A. In 3 and 4, we're using the same scenario, but reversing the variables around. So now B is a function of A. So again, A is our input this time, our domain. And then B is the output, so that would be our range. Again, notice we switch the statement around, and the domain and the range switch. So let's look at some context here. Complete the statement using the context of the scenario. In 2014, County X had 783 miles of paved roads, M. Starting in 2015, the county has been building 8 miles of new paved roads each year. Let N be the number of years after 2014. First thing I want to identify is I want to identify what variables I have. Based on the statement, I'm seeing two variables, M and N. So what I want to know then is which affects the other, and that's going to help me identify inputs and outputs, and later we're going to call this domain and range. So we want to think about this. There's two scenarios. One is the number of paved roads affects what year it is. So if that were true, that means that County X could pave 120 miles of road, and that would mean that 15 years had passed. We know that's not true. The other scenario is, does the year since 2014 affect how many miles of paved road that County X has? That would be a true statement. So the number of years is affecting the number of paved miles of road. So what we're going to say then, that quantity that affects the other, that's our input. So N, the number of years after 2014, would be our input. The output in this case is the miles of paved road. So essentially what we're looking at is we want to know which of the two affects the other. In most of the cases, we'll have a pretty clear distinction. That quantity that affects the other is our input, and the quantity that's being affected is our output. Think of it in terms of science class. Science class, you guys talked, assuming anyway, you talked about an independent versus a dependent variable. The independent variable is the one that affects the other. That's an input. The dependent variable is the one that's being affected. That's our output. So when we're writing this as a function statement, notice it says is a function of. So that's a tip-off to me that our input here will be on this line. A function of whatever the input is. And then the other part, the beginning of it, is the output. We want to know what is being affected and what is affecting it. So the output here is the number of miles of paved roads. That's a function of the years after 2014. Let's look at another one here. To edit a manuscript, Miguel charges $50 for the first 2 hours of work and $20 per hour after the first 2 hours. C is the amount Miguel charges after each hours of work. So again, we want to think about this in terms of what's going to affect the other. One scenario is the amount that Miguel charges will affect how many hours he works. So he could go into the project saying, I'm going to charge you $150. This is how many hours I'm going to work because I'm charging this amount. Again, that doesn't seem to make sense. The other situation would be the number of hours he works will affect how much he charges. So if he works 10 hours, he's going to charge this amount. If he works 15 hours, he's going to charge this amount. That seems to be the most reasonable scenario. So then we're going to identify then that the input is the H hours of work. And the output is the amount that Miguel charges. So just like we did up at the top, the output is that first thing we're going to mention, because that's what we're interested in. How much is he going to charge? So the amount Miguel charges is a function of, well, his input, which in this case was the number of hours that he works. Works more, he's going to charge more. Works less, he's going to charge less. So that's how we're going to read those situations. So let's take a look at the next piece of this, which is identifying domain variables and range variables, and what do they mean in context. So we're going to use a different scenario because we've already looked at these. Well, actually, you know what? Let's go ahead. Let's look at that first one here. In 2014 County Exit 7, that whole scenario we started with. So we've already identified that N was the number of years after 2014. That was our input. And that M, the number of miles of paved road, was our output. So the domain variable and the range variable, they're already given to us. We just have to figure out which is which. We've already talked about input being the domain and output being the range. So the input in this case was N, so that's our domain variable. And then in context, what does that mean? Well, it's the number of years after 2014. Our range in this case is M. And in context, it's the number of miles of paved roads. All right, so let's take a look at another problem here. Let's go with this one. Gary learned that the value of his car, V, depreciates by 15% per year, T. So again, we want to know, will the value affect the time? Not likely. Or will the time that he owns the car affect the value? That seems like the more likely scenario. So I'm going to identify then that T is my input and V is my output. So the domain would be T. And we got to be careful with this. At 15%, yes, that's important information if we were going to set up an equation and solve it, but there's no equation here yet. We just know that T represents the number of years he's owned the car. And then the range would be V, because that's our output, and that's the value of Gary's car. So it's just like we did in the first part, we're identifying the input, the output, but now we're specifically saying this is the domain, this is the range, and to identify those variables that provide that.